name's Kaylie Borden O'Brien. I'm the Museum Education Specialist here, and I think Schooners are really, really neat. Raise your hand just in front of me if you were around Maine in 1998. Saw Wiscasset Schooners. I think it's just demographics. You know, we have some very knowledgeable and experienced maritime historians here. In 1998, I was a kindergartner in Idaho. So I have no first-hand experience with these schooners. And I think a lot of people here online probably don't either, but that's the cool thing about it, because 78 of you still chose to show up, and I'm still really interested in what this story can tell us about how people value history and how Mainers value history specifically. So without further ado, if my screen will let me click through. There we go. Let's meet our schooners. The Luther Little, that was completed in 19. There's schooner underway, actually sailing is this one we have of the Luther Little right here. And it might not actually be the Luther Little, which was a famously white painted vessel, unless it's some point during its working life, it was painted black and then painted white again before it became the famous wreck that we know and love. This could be the Hesper, this could be another Wiscasset schooner, but it is in our collection labeled as the Luther Little. At any rate, the big question that we have to start out with, of course, that many of you already know the answer to, is why two wooden, wind-propelled, four-masted schooners were built in a traditional style in 1917 and 1918, when so many competing technologies were already prevalent. During World War I, why would this happen? I know some of you already know. But for those who don't, I feel like this headline really says it all. This is a headline, of course, about the Luther Little floating. There isn't any background information. It's just a beautiful photo that isn't too beautiful for us, along with some neighboring headlines. So over here, I guess on my audience's left, we've got the Russian Revolution being in its third or fourth month. We have just a couple months before Russia is going to sign an armistice in World War I to settle its own issues at home. And we also have German aerial warfare, German airplanes being shot down by the British on the other side. So this all-wood vessel was launched at the same time as...
We're back. So I will bring your attention back to the fact that these vessels that were built with technologies hundreds of years old, powered only by the wind, coexisted with not only warplanes, but also submarines that were actively hunting vessels like this on the open seas. It's a really interesting time. And another thing that's kind of unique to these two schooners is that not only did they kind of have their entire lifespan within the 20th century, not even making it 100 years, although they were known to be relics, really old things that looked older than they were, but they also kind of represent how Maine and New England, they were built in Massachusetts, not Maine, but how Maine and New England was able to keep wooden shipbuilding alive through World War I. Indeed, 1920, even after these vessels were built, was the last great schooner built. Oh, and I can't click to change. There we go. All right, so why did a shipyard decide it was going to build two giant wooden schooners at this time? The first reason is, of course, financial. Freight rates, as some of you might be aware, are the price that a shipping company can charge the companies it's working with to carry freight from one place to another. And during wartime, that rate can skyrocket because not only is it more dangerous to carry freight across the Atlantic Ocean, for example, when it's crawling with German U-boats, but there's also a huge demand for goods and services. Countries need to move people, food, ammunition, fuel, all manner of things across oceans. And in this case specifically, France had already blockaded Germany and had pulled all sorts of merchant craft into that blockade. So France wasn't carrying supplies. Britain was not carrying supplies. The United States and many of its companies saw that there was this opportunity to make a tidy profit by carrying goods as neutrals. Did this stop German U-boats from sinking American merchant vessels? It did not. At least 150, maybe more, but that is what the U.S. Merchant Marine Museum says, were sunk by German U-boats prior to U.S. entry into war. So this was a high-risk, high-reward venture. And there was a company called Rogers and Webb in Somerset, Massachusetts, that decided it was worth it to build these 2 wooden cargo vessels and take advantage of these wartime circumstances. This was also kind of an echo of the Spanish-American War back in the late 1890s that in recent-ish memory for the shipbuilders engaged here had similarly spiked freight rates and had caused a wooden shipbuilding boom. So this is kind of a sequel to that same war. They saw what way the wind was blowing and started building vessels. Right here where you are sitting, if you're here in person, at the Percy and Small shipyard, this was the time at which Percy and Small as a company decided to start selling off their wooden vessels. They saw that this would be a short-lived boom. However, the impetus to try and take advantage of it was clearly enough for Rogers and Webb, this shipping company, to pay the Reed Brothers Shipyard to build 2 vessels. And that's where our first kind of game of historical telephone comes into play. Really fast, why wooden vessels? The answer is, again, primarily financial. There was already the infrastructure throughout New England to build these great schooners. There was a skilled workforce and yards that had the correct area and materials. There was also kind of a legal component in that a federal organization called the Emergency Fleet Corporation had essentially commandeered all steel shipyards in the United States to build merchant vessels and or repair naval vessels for the war. So there wasn't competition between these essentially government-run shipyards if a company decided it wanted to build a wooden vessel. Also, wooden vessels like schooners were really cheap to man, comparatively speaking. At this point, motorized vessels were powered by steam and needed at least 1 licensed engineer. A sailing vessel, even if it had a donkey engine, an auxiliary small engine, probably powered by coal to do things like raise its huge sails and its heavy anchors, a sailing vessel didn't need a licensed engineer on board, so that's 1 fewer person you need. And the wind is also free. You don't have to pay for or carry fuel if you're depending on the wind to move your vessel. Keep that in mind when we see some of the passage times that Luther Little and Hesper ended up making, because they were actually fairly competitive with steam at this time. It was still a fairly emergent technology. The last part is a little dark, but if you build a boat for cheap and man it for cheap, it's relatively expendable. You might see in contemporary sources the thought that, oh, well, German U-boats can't detect wooden vessels, but that was not borne out in reality. Many of these great schooners, even ones from pretty high-profile Maine collier fleets like the Palmer fleet, some of those vessels were built right here, or even Percy and Small's house fleet were sunk by U-boats. So the Luther Little is our first boat, and as I said, there's a little bit of a mystery and or confusion surrounding its construction. The Reed brothers, which can be spelled 1 of 2 ways, there are 2 Reeds here, was the shipyard in Somerset, Massachusetts that was chosen by Rogers and Webb to build this vessel. They build the vessel, and then in February 1917, when most of the vessel is completed, the entire shipyard burns in a dramatic conflagration. It's a massive loss. There's no more Luther Little. Most of the buildings on this shipyard are burned down, and they don't actually financially recover. They do start immediately building another Luther Little because it's 1917, the war is on, the US is just about to wade into the war. In fact, between the time the second Luther Little's keel was laid in February 1917 and when it was launched, the US officially declared war on Germany. So during that time as well, this vessel is being built in a hurry, at a shipyard that is being repaired and built as kind of time goes on. The shipyard gets sold to a firm called Crown and Shield and Swayze. You thought Reed versus Reed was confusing. There's also Swayze with a Z versus Swayze with an S. Both are used in all sorts of contemporary sources. So the actual company building this boat changes in the middle of the race. And Crown and Shield is the shipyard that technically launches the Luther Little in December of 1917. It was apparently a very smooth launch. There was a lot of fanfare with it as well, because according to people at the time, a large wooden vessel like this hadn't been built on the Taunton River since 1860. So when the Luther Little takes to the water, it's already like an oddity, this old-fashioned time machine. Newspapers of the time talk about how hundreds of people would flood the shipyard while the vessel was under construction, wanting to go down below, wanting to look at it, wanting to learn all of the specific names that sound funny from the shipwrights, which was rather annoying for them, but they were good sports about it. And I think it's really interesting that even in 1917, before it was even launched, the Luther Little was kind of an old oddity that people were fascinated by. These vessels were both built primarily to be colliers to haul coal from the southern United States, not only to New England, but to all the other places around the industrialized world that might need coal and pay a pretty penny for it. But that ended up being a relatively small chunk of what the Little actually did. There is this very dramatic advertisement for coal that runs in a paper directly above the announcement of the Little being launched, which I think is a really interesting juxtaposition of, well, this vessel is built on collier lines to move coal, and even though it's an old-fashioned vessel, is still going to be a trustworthy moneymaker. There's this lovely quote from the Fall River Herald News that I am going to read while you look at this picture of the crew who built the Luther Little in front of it. Remember that these guys are kind of closer to today's traditional shipwrights and people who work primarily building tall ships than to someone who'd be building a steel vessel. They're performing an antiquated trade at this point, and here's what the newspaper says about them. The men who worked faithfully and well to build this valuable acquisition to Uncle Sam's carrying forces have the satisfaction of knowing that they have contributed materially to the defeat of the Kaiser, for the slogan, "Food will win the war," is coming more and more to be recognized as the keynote of the situation. So there's like this thread of patriotism and this thread of going towards a bigger cause that also informs why these vessels were built quickly, and built without necessarily the intention for them to become these beloved historical pieces of the past. So you'll see in many books from more recent times, Luther Little being credited as being built at the Reed shipyard. At the time, it was credited to Crown and Shield. I bet if we asked all of the people here who come bringing significant background knowledge about the Luther Little, half would say it was built at Reed, half would say it was built at Crown and Shield. Does that matter? I don't know. If you care about it, I suppose it matters. But that's one of these mysteries that follows the Luther Little throughout its entire history. In case you're and just real quick, Hesper's keel was laid the minute the Little was off the ways. So these vessels are truly sister ships built by the same crew in the same place, even though many sources often say, well, one was built at Reed Brothers, one was built at Crown and Shield. Those are the same thing. If you're someone who's hearing this and is saying, oh, Crown and Shield, like that famous naval architect who designed the largest schooner ever, the Thomas W. Lawson that had 7 masts, you would be correct. Same guy. There's also a tall ship called the Adventurous out in the Puget Sound, built in 1913 in Booth Bay, also designed by Crown and Shield, originally to be an Arctic exploration schooner, which I think is pretty cool. Yes, that is the same Crown and Shield, but he did not design the Little and the Hesper. as you've just found out, they were already designed. One entire vessel was built and burned, and another was started by the time Crown and Shield came on the scene. So even though they were launched under his name, they don't exactly have the same design lineage as these schooners right here. What they do share some DNA with is these vessels down on the bottom. These are Coast Guard cutters called six-bitters. That refers to the fact they're 75 feet long. 6 times 15. 15 is a bit, I suppose, in old-fashioned speak. Anyway, they're called six-bitters, and they were used primarily during Prohibition to chase rum runners, which I think is a pretty cool lineage to share with Hesper and Luther Little, even if they weren't part of the great Crown and Shield fleet of schooners. All right, here's the Luther Little entering the water. You'll notice that it is painted white. You'll notice that it's throwing a nice big wave as it enters the water. It's a very calm day. We are going to juxtapose this with the Hesper. Oh, sorry. After we talk about the Little's career, it had a pretty normal career all told as schooners go. The most exciting incident in Luther Little's career was saving 2 U.S. Navy ensigns who were on a balloon surveillance mission off the coast of New Jersey. The Little was sailing along when it saw something, or the captain rather, saw something strange in the water, and they decided to go check it out. The captain tacked around, they sailed up and saw 2 people floating in a big mess of cloth. And what they immediately thought was this was a trap laid by the Germans, and they were going to get boarded and sunk. So they turned around and tried to sail away. And these 2 poor ensigns in the water, whose balloon is sinking under them, started shouting in multiple languages because, of course, they didn't know who was on this schooner. They didn't know what nationality it was, and that was very suspicious to the captain of the Luther Little. Eventually, they worked it out, and the ensigns were saved. But otherwise, the Little's career was relatively normal. It ran aground a normal amount of times, specifically in Haiti a couple of times, because as the coal trade became dominated by steamships, the Little started carrying logwood instead. As different parts of the United States became deforested, logwood became something that could be purchased in the Caribbean and in South America, and then brought north from those places. So some photos you'll see of the vessels show them with timber ports to load massive logs in, and that's actually a fairly convenient cargo because it floats. And if the vessel runs aground, it will float on its own cargo. Now we get to the Hesper. Notice that even the newspapers, this is from the Portland Press Herald, often referred to it as the Hester and were chastised for that. So this is most certainly the Hesper, not the Hester. It was most definitely built in the Crown and Shield Yard. No confusion about Reed Brothers there. Launched on the 4th of July, and it stuck on the ways. It went nowhere for 7 weeks, and multiple attempts with tugboats to pull the Hesper off were unsuccessful until finally, in August, about 2 months before the end of World War I, the Hesper finally floated free on the high tide without tug assistance. I'd like to think that the Hesper has a little bit of attitude if you are someone who subscribes to large wooden vessels having personalities like horses. So the Hesper was owned by the same company as the Luther Little, carried very similar cargoes and went very similar places as the Little. Although because it entered the scene a whole year later, it also had some more European cargoes, carrying primarily fuel like case oil or kerosene to the war in Europe. In 1928, the Hesper caused some damage. It was still successfully carrying cargo in 1928, right before the Great Depression, and was docked in Rockport Harbor when a northeaster blew it off of its dock, ran it aground, and essentially used it as a battering ram to cause massive damage. So much damage in Rockport that the Hesper was banned from Rockport Harbor and had to be towed to Portland Harbor, where it sat on a mooring derelict. There was also almost a mutiny on the Hesper. A sailor walked up the weather side of the deck to take the helm. And if you are someone who's familiar with the customs of the sea, the weather side of the vessel is often reserved for the captain. It's the high side. You won't get wet. A sailor walked up the weather side and insulted the captain, and both of them were armed and shot their pistols at each other. The captain did prevail, but there was a very high-profile trial about it that makes a lot of headlines for the Hesper. Here's a very quick comparison of them. These are truly sister ships. The Hesper was only 6 feet longer and slightly bigger to be proportional, but otherwise they were pretty standard four-masted schooners, not especially remarkable in terms of size. So, what happened, my friends who are in front of me, between 1928, when the Hesper broke everything in Rockport Harbor, and 1932, when their next act begins? What's the big historical event we're looking for? Yes, the crash and the Great Depression. So it almost goes without saying that these vessels don't have many cargoes to carry by 1932 and are both swinging at anchor in Portland Harbor. It's pretty expensive to keep a shipkeeper on board, which was the law at the time. So the company that owned the vessels was trying to get them off of its hands. A man named Frank Winter, who was a lumber baron, an entrepreneur from Palermo, Maine, purchased both schooners for around $600. You might recall that the first Luther Little that burned was counted as a loss of $60,000. About 15 years later, that figure is significantly lower. So Winter had a vision. He had a railroad that went from Wiscasset through Waterville and then to Farmington. Hence, it was known as the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railroad, or WWF. And his vision was that he could bring timber from northern Maine down to the coast on his narrow gauge railway. He could load it onto schooners and could discharge coal that his schooners brought up from the southern United States to fuel the railway. A perfect plan. Unfortunately, he made all these large purchases of the railway and the schooners while also owning a timber operation during the Great Depression. He was very much in debt. In 1934, he even had to rip up sections of his track to repay some debts. So that operation never ended up happening. And when Winter died suddenly in 1936, his entire estate was insolvent. There's a fantastic quote about why no one bothered to move the schooners from where he had had them towed to their final home in Wiscasset. He had dropped them there, hoping they could soon carry lumber south from his trains, but they never left that place. And the town of Wiscasset was not necessarily interested in solving this problem immediately. According to a reporter, the vagueness of titles was the reason that no one bothered to try and repossess these schooners, although the other factor is that they were essentially worthless at this time. In the 1930s, there were more vacant schooners floating around Maine than you could shake a stick at. This is also famously the time in 1936 that the windjammer trade takes off, when an enterprising art teacher decided he was going to buy up some much smaller, more manageable schooners and start sailing them around as dude cruisers, just like dude ranches out west would have people come to pay and pretend to be a cowboy. This gentleman said, well, there are so many of these schooners, I will buy them. People can come pay me to pretend to be a sailor. These windjammers are still very successful today. But the Depression is the thing that really turns Maine's maritime history from kind of a viable wooden sailing vessel-based economy to, all right, we are fully joining the modern era, and these vessels pass from being the pickup trucks of their time to being history. This is a postcard that we have in our collection here at the museum. You'll notice it says Luther Little under tow to her final berth. It was sent to Lynn Snow, who's one of the great writers about this shipyard in this area. But you'll also notice that the vessel titled Luther Little is dark of hull, and the Luther Little, again, famously a white painted vessel. Is this the Hesper? Is this another boat? Is it the Little with another paint job? History will keep its secrets from us on this account, but I really like how we have kind of this transitional moment of the Luther Little going from being a cargo vessel to being stuck in the mud for the next 66 years. Like, this is the moment when it was happening, and we have a photo of it in the museum. So there was essentially a fire sale for Frank Winter to take advantage of, and he purchased the vessels. You can see that this is the Hesper right when it was purchased in Portland. So it still looks pretty boat-shaped. There are sails still on the vessel. It looks like it could be a competitive cargo carrier still. However, that doesn't last long. I wanted to show a picture of exactly where in Wiscasset the vessels were beached because, as I've said, I wasn't someone who was around for actually seeing them. And it's fascinating to see just how close to that big bridge that gets crowded with tourists every summer they were, because this is the point at which the vessels go from just being regular old schooners to being the most photographed vessels potentially in the world. Even in 1932, as soon as they were beached in Wiscasset, families, children, all comers could climb on board, as this cute girl is right here, and kind of play on them. There were young men who would pay the watchmen to let them climb on the vessels, shinny up to the top of the masts, and then go hand over hand between the masts on the stays. And I love this photo of the folks. This is on the deck of the Hesper that we'll talk about why it's so tilted in a minute. But if you compare the horizon line to the tilt of the family pictured, it's quite dramatic. And and this is from the 1930s. Oh, there we go. So very quickly, these vessels become beloved by tourists and locals alike, and they also start deteriorating rapidly. So we're kind of going to take a little trip year by year as the photographic record stands. I'm using images from the museum's collection for this wherever I can to kind of trace how quickly a wooden vessel can go to seed when it's not taken care of. We've got them right here in 1932. Both vessels have their full rigs, but you can see just how in the mud they are. And you can see why these vessels start tilting immediately, because at low tide, there's very little water around them. In fact, that's one of the reasons that the Hesper lost its masts very quickly. In 1940, they were cut down by a salvager so that the vessel could be towed closer to the Little and closer to shore and get it out of the navigational channel. So in basically every other picture we're going to see, the Hesper is the one with no masts, and they were pretty unceremoniously cut down. And the same salvager that took those masts also took all of the very valuable deck machinery, things that could be reused on a steamship, like the donkey engines, like the windlasses, all of the kind of deck tackle. We're going to go through a timeline of deterioration, but just broad strokes to kind of put some context on it. In 1945, when the end of World War II was announced, both vessels were set on fire in celebration. The fire department did put it out, but Hesper particularly was very badly damaged by the fire. And we'll see some pictures of the fire damage, although in black and white, it's not as dramatic. The Little hung on for quite a while, in fact, so long that there were multiple attempts to try and refurbish it, maybe to sail, and when that dream failed, maybe to just be a dockside attraction. But it was doomed. An earthquake took out one of its masts in 1979, and the other three blew down right before the end in 1995. So by 1998, both hulks were entirely gone, but let's see how we got there. Here are some of the earliest photos of the Luther Little as a hulk we get. Notice the white painted sides. And you can see that for a while, the Little still remains like a boat. Like there could be hope for interested parties to refurbish this vessel. The Hesper, not so much. Many of the deck houses were cut down for scrap. You can notice just how far the vessel is tilting by looking at the horizon line right here in the upper right-hand corner. This vessel became in a very bad way very, very quickly. So when it was time for local folks to try and figure out which vessel should be prioritized for care and saving, it was very easy to determine that the Hesper was not it. Here they are together in 1948, and I want to point out a couple of things because we're going to chart pieces falling off together. First of all, the Little still has its bowsprit and jibboom, both protruding pieces of headrig right here. And the Hesper still has its chunky bowsprit, and they both have martingales, these very short spars I'll be able to show you in different photos, like right here. They have these short spars hanging down that were considered to be hazards by locals because, of course, to get to these vessels, you have to climb up somehow. Many people would try and climb up the headrig. Having a 6-foot big chunk of wood hanging down and dangling right above that place, rather dangerous. So in 1957, a year before this photo was taken, we have our first attempt by some entity in Wiscasset to potentially refurbish the schooners. They've been here for over 20 years at this point. But the Wiscasset Industrial Development Corps was a group of business people who decided they were going to try and solicit investment to rebuild the Wiscasset waterfront, try and make it pleasant for tourists, and potentially capitalize on the fact that so many people were stopping in Wiscasset specifically to photograph these vessels. So even as the vessels continue to deteriorate, right here you can see that a topmast has fallen from the Luther Little. You can see that it's lost its great big jibboom, and you can see that the paint has fallen off the vessels. They look very rough in this picture, which is undated, but we can place based on what parts are missing. You can see that maybe it was a risky gamble already to try and stake the town's tourism future on these vessels. But that did not stop the WIDC from trying to solicit grants of between $15,000 and $550,000 to try and get the Wiscasset waterfront up to snuff, including different opportunities for people to safely visit these vessels. I include these ones here because we have this gentleman from Olympia, Washington. He is trying to get close to the vessels, and you can see how they are surrounded by jagged pilings, tilting ever more. And the pieces of the rig that are falling off do look very dangerous. This was often commented upon at the time, but it wasn't anyone's job to go out and fix them. The WIDC had taken over all of the land and assets owned by the WW&F, railroad, schooners, waterfront property, and all, but it was certainly not within their purview to try and get professional riggers to come and fix these vessels that probably were never going to go anywhere again. Here we have all but one topmast of the Little having fallen down, often in dramatic ways that scared locals into thinking, oh, someone will certainly be hurt by one of these at some time soon. In 1967, as this damage is accelerating, the town tried to figure out, okay, can tax dollars be put towards these vessels? And the answer was no. The town soundly rejected that. And a 1968 follow-up study said that it would be impractical to try and rehabilitate the schooners. Financially speaking, they would be available as hulks to be photographed for another 25 years. This was a very accurate prediction, but it wouldn't make financial sense to try and bring them back to a sailing or even dockside condition. So this is kind of the first very loud death knell for these schooners, although some groups of people continued to try and bring them back even after this time. Here are some of the plans that the WIDC tried to put forward. You can see that a beautiful pier extending between the vessels was part of it. But the fact that the schooners are included at all in these plans just floors me because there were many opportunities to get rid of them. The older these vessels got, the louder public sentiment became that they were ruining the prettiest little village in Maine. They looked tacky, they looked dangerous, they needed to go. And yet, in 1968, all of the different plans for what a future Wiscasset could look like not only included Hesper and Luther Little, but they were centered around them. Like these vessels were iconic enough to kind of stand the test of deteriorating and still be important enough to enough people that they would stick around. I have this beautiful picture right here, and I'm so sorry to those of you on Zoom, but I have free posters of this image for everyone who came here in person. So on that back table, you can see we have many posters of the schooners under snow. It's an undated picture, and I'm not sure if it's the exact same photograph or a very similar schooners in the snow poster we have, but we have them there. So if you're here in person, please take one on your way out. If you're on Zoom and you want one, you can come to our museum store and get one. All right, but of course, this is the 70s now. Things are changing rapidly. The Environmental Protection Agency is now on the scene, and there are significant worries that not only are these hulks dangerous to people exploring them and climbing on board, but they're also dangerous to the environment. Something is going to have to change. I threw this in here. This is an excerpt from a little tourist brochure from 1975, which was, of course, the last big anniversary the United States celebrated. And there was a resurgence of maybe historical appreciation around the bicentennial of the United States that had some pretty big ripple effects in Maine. Tourists were encouraged to not only see these vessels, but go to Bath Marine Museum, a dynamic and fascinating place, which of course would become Maine Maritime Museum. Unfortunately, only 3 years later, even with the kind of public profile of these vessels raised by now being included in formal tourist literature, on the 4th of July, which is Hesper's birthday, the day that it was launched, if you remember, someone tossed a sparkler on board the vessel and it caught fire. This is kind of the big pivot point for Hesper specifically. The WIDC decided it wanted nothing to do with the vessels anymore. In fact, it fully sold off all of its assets in the area and essentially left the scene, partly because of how damaged the Hesper was because of this fire. Now, it was put out. The vessel was still not that different from the crumbling hulk it was. But this was a wake-up call to those people who were in Wiscasset and really still cared about the vessels. A group called the Friends of the Wiscasset Schooners started a nonprofit and started soliciting donations to try and get the vessels back in at least a stable condition that would allow them to continue being a part of the Wiscasset waterfront. However, that nonprofit dissolved in 1981. I like that one of the main strategies of the Friends of the Wiscasset Schooners was to solicit donations from very wealthy people or businesses that had something to do with schooners or photography. They went to Eastman Kodak and asked for $1 million, hoping that because these were the most photographed vessels in the entire country, certainly a photography company would have a vested interest in keeping them around, but they got a no from that. All right, 1980. These vessels are owned by a nonprofit that will promptly fold. And there are some other historical refurbishment things going on in the background. You might remember those railroad tracks that had their terminus right at the schooners, the WW&F that Frank Winter had. Parts of them were torn up even during Winter's lifetime. And the paint company, Sherwin-Williams, was actually one of the companies to whom the Winter estate was indebted. And Sherwin-Williams had to send a team to pull up even more track to help settle that debt. At any rate, in 1992, or I guess by 1992, a group of interested volunteers had gotten together, a landowner had donated land, and much of that track was laid back down, and excursion trains were happening on the part down near Wiscasset. Those of you who've been on the narrow gauge railway at the current WW&F Museum, this was part of that initial push. So these schooners were kind of described as, oh, this is the starting point for your rail excursion. And I think it's very interesting that this other part of the business continued on and is still active today, even as these incredibly visible schooners were on the decline. In 1990, Hesper finally gave up the ghost, went from being a relatively boat-shaped wreck to being a complete wreck of a boat. You can also see that the Little is not doing well. There are planks pulling apart here where the bow is falling in. The entire head rig, the pointy part up front, has fallen into the water. And two of its masts were in such danger that the Friends of the Wiscasset Schooners had tried to use a rope gun to shoot a rope and tie them together. Much easier said than done. But at this point, the town decides something needs to happen, a plan needs to be put in place. And after much decision making and quite a few editorials, in 1998, a wrecking company was engaged to finally take the vessels apart. They had held on between 1995 and 1997, hoping something could be done, potentially a museum or some other way to publicly honor the legacy of the vessels would be built. But in 1997, the Little lost the rest of its masts. They all fell over and it became extra hazardous to be there among not only these massive giant Oregon firs that had fallen over, but all of the rigging that had kept them up for 60 years. They were now hazardous embarrassments. So the salvage company comes in. It takes first all of the potentially valuable bits, sets them aside. The rest of the vessels were brought to the town dump and run through a wood chipper. So while we don't have the holes of the vessels to see anymore, they do continue to have a life. And I imagine some people here might be familiar with where, maybe even in their own houses, parts of the Luther Little and the Hesper live on. As of 2015, these were piles of Wiscasset schooner that are still at the Wiscasset dump. I'm not sure if they have been moved. There has been talk, it seems, every 5 years or so of making some kind of monument to the schooners in Wiscasset, but to my knowledge, that isn't happening yet. Maine Maritime Museum also has some significant pieces. We've got Hesper's martingale, this downward kind of dangling when it's a hulk spar that is used to tension the headrig downward and keep it from being blown off the front of the vessel by the force of the sails on the spar. That is in our snow squall building, and there's a deadeye. That's one of these kind of structural pieces made out of lignum vitae, a very strong wood. That's either from the Hesper or the Luther Little that you can also see in the collection. And there are even more pieces from the Little. An entire four-mast masthead section is in the blacksmith shop, as well as this great big masthead iron. And those are things that you yourselves can go see and touch and stand under and try and get the scale of just how massive these vessels were. They were said to be the last four-masted schooners at the time of their demise, and unless there are any four-masted schooners left sailing around Europe or something I'm not aware of, then these truly were the last of their kind. So the big question is, why do we care? Why did all of you show up for a lecture on the Wiscasset schooners today? Only you can answer that. But I find it fascinating just how much of a life they've had beyond their time of being literally sent through a wood chipper. People are still painting them. If you go to our museum store, you can buy multiple pieces of merch that have their picture on it. The Wiscasset Police Department, to my knowledge, still has them on its official patch. So these vessels are still kind of part of the identity of Wiscasset, part of lots of living people's memories, and they make you think how much money, time, effort, and attention history is worth, but also who's going to pay for it. History is expensive. Of course, we wish we could preserve every important piece of the past, but who's going to do it and where does the money come from? Just off the top of my head, here's a scattering of non-Wiscasset towns and their town seals that officially use the image of a traditionally rigged sailing vessel as part of their brand. Outside of just Wiscasset, these vessels are a huge part of what this region conceives of itself as, and I think that that's fascinating, that these two schooners, these incredibly visible pieces of history, lasted much longer than most of these other towns' actual shipbuilding or ship-owning centers. But that doesn't mean that that part of the identity has gone away. In 2017, an artist named Nick Dalton built a beautiful Hesper drinking fountain where you could drink from the R. I'm not sure if it's still up. And pieces of the vessels can be found in various places. This is a kitchen of someone who lost their house in a fire, and I think it's very fitting that wood, particularly from the Hesper, a vessel that burned twice and was the younger sibling of a vessel that burned on the ways, would be used by carpenters to rebuild someone's kitchen that had been lost to a fire. You can technically buy pens made out of the vessels, although they're sold out at the moment if you go to the Peel Pen Shop. And supposedly there are some clocks running around made out of cross sections of the huge masts of the vessels, although I could not find a picture of those. You can also experience the WW&F Railway. They operate throughout most of the year and are an absolutely thriving history organization in a way that the Hesper and Luther Little never really became. If you're someone who wants to continue living in the mindset of a four-masted schooner crew or fancier, I do have some suggested books, two of which are in the museum store, although The Log of the Skipper's Wife, which is the diary of a woman who was married to the captain of a four-masted schooner, is, I think, required reading for any Maine maritime history buff.